Have you ever gone through a dry season in your spiritual life? What can you do to break through a dry season so that you can then not just simply be going through the motions, but your walk with the Lord can be fresh? Well, David gives us a psalm to help us break through today on the Word for 2022. Today we're in Psalm 63. Now this psalm was written by David while he was in the desert of Judah. In verse 1, he gives us a picture of where he was at spiritually. David says, "O God, you are my God, and earnestly I seek you. My soul thirsts for you, my body longs for you, in a dry and weary land where there is no water." You know, on average, we can go about 3 minutes without air and 3 days without water. David is likening not having water with not having God's presence with him. David says, "My soul thirsts for you, and my body longs for you." He wasn't longing for God's gifts, or he wasn't longing for God's blessings, but he was longing for God himself, to be in his presence. So when we're dry spiritually, David again gives us 5 things that we can do to break through. So let's follow his example. The first thing that David does is he takes time to think. He remembers. He recalls the past. In verse 2, David says, "I have seen you in the sanctuary and beheld your power and your glory." David is encouraging us, and he was encouraging himself, to stop looking around and look up. Paul even says in Colossians chapter 3, verse 2, "Set your minds on things above and not on earthly things." When we do, then we get a brand new perspective. We can see life from God's perspective. So David is saying, review God's glory and review God's power. Review what he has done and what he has created. Review what God has promised and delivered. The second thing that David does is he takes time then to thank. He started praising the Lord. He was telling God how thankful he was for all that God has done, provided, and how God has spoken. In verses 3 through 5, David blesses God with his lips and with uplifted hands. Let me ask you a question. How do you feel when you are complimented? And how do people respond when you compliment them? Well, words of life bring joy, and they can change the atmosphere, and they can change a relationship. And so David spends time thanking the Lord. He's letting God know what God means to him, and that changed his perspective too. The third thing that David did was he meditated. In verse 6, David, he says that he's going to fix his mind upon the Lord. "On my bed I remember you. I think about you through the watches of the night." When I read this verse, I think, instead of counting sheep, David says, start thinking about what God has done. Focus upon him. And when you do, you not only will your mind be renewed, but your body will get rest as well. The fourth thing that David says is that he will then take time to sing. In verses 7 through 10, David says he's going to sing a song of deliverance. He's going to sing a song of victory and of faith before the answer comes. Before the victory comes, David says, "I will," and then they will be. There's a difference. He starts with singing before the answer comes, and that changes things for him as well. The last thing that David does, in verse 11, he says, "I will praise." David determines to praise God in the midst of problems, in the midst of difficulties, in the midst of trials. David says, the king will rejoice. In the dryness of simply going through the motions, David, he tells us 5 things to do to break through. To think, to remember, and to recall. To thank. We really do have more to thank God for than we do to complain about. 3 is to meditate. Fix your mind upon the Lord. 4, sing, and sing with a purpose. And 5, praise in the midst of problems. When we do those 5 things, as David has outlined here in Psalm 63, we will get a new perspective on life. We will stay close to the Lord, and we will have a breakthrough. Thank you for joining the Word for 2022.